Look, thanks everybody, and especially for giving up your public holiday, even if it's sort of semi-lockdown, isn't it? I do some really weird stuff, some of which probably people wouldn't recognise as accounting-related research. And I guess I got into this visual area about 15 years ago, when I was at a British Academy of Management conference, where there was this parallel session, which was somebody reading poetry about management and a young woman who was talking about her PhD, where she'd used photo elicitation in an IT company. And I was really, really fascinated. And so I actually enlisted her paper for my journal, and then we became co-researchers, and blah, 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 on it went. So I've now more recently been applying photo and film elicitation methodology, looking at offices, and I won't go into the office bit, but I just thought I'd sort of talk today a bit about the basic photo and film elicitation methods that they've been used more in visual anthropology, visual sociology. There are a few papers in the management and accounting disciplines that have used it. So I just thought this might be interesting given what you guys do. I suppose if I'm talking to a business management sort of audience, they mostly tend to ignore the visual world. And yet, as I point out to them, when we look at a lot of the communications that we're subject to or that we produce, even if they're just in like web form or formal written form, of course, there's masses of visuals in there. And when we sort of think across our iPads and our notebooks and our iPhones and all the rest of it, a lot of that's visual too. And yet, as researchers, we ignore it. And so it's just another way of getting a different look at the past and different look at the present. Now, the key thing, which you'll all be aware of, is that, of course, when we look at, say, photographs, I mean, they are all socially constructed. I mean, they're socially constructed by the photographer who decided what to shoot, how close up, how to frame it, how far away, and either consciously or unconsciously by anybody who's in that photo. And then, of course, there's another layer of interpretation which we as a researcher may apply when we're looking at what got produced, either looking at iconic meanings or indexical meanings. But also we can go and talk to other people about how they interpret the photographs. Now, they may have been people who were a subject of the photograph, or they may be people who had nothing to do with it. So photo and film, therefore, becomes a new additional historical text to written text. And it gives us the opportunity to induce either contemporary or historical or both meanings out of it as researchers, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And we can also interview third parties, because sometimes that can give us broader knowledge about the issues and the context that may be embedded in those photographs or surrounding those photographs. So in other words, the photograph might be about some micro issue, but it may trigger reflections and new understandings about macro issues within which the micro was situated. So it does mean that we can access stuff, be it events or contexts or situations that go well beyond whatever's been reported to us or by us in the printed text, and we can analyse that hermeneutically or critically, just as we do with printed text. And of course, we can also elicit people's attitudes and people's concepts and people's experiences. So I suppose there's one other point I should make, and that is that I certainly have the feeling that when I'm engaging in staring at photographs, it gives me some approximate, inadequate, yes, but approximate sense or feeling of what it might have been like to be there. I've certainly had that experience looking at historical photos of people working in offices, you know, back in sort of 1900, 1910, 1920. It amazes me how sharp some of those archival photographs are. And if they're close up to people, you really get the feeling of just sitting among them. Certainly as an interdisciplinary researcher, I've always argued that we often pay a lot of attention as researchers to what people do and what they say, but the experiencing of the emotion of the situation can tell us a lot, and often we don't pay attention to that. So when we get to textual analysis, if you know, just a baseline approach, you know, you've got a sample of photos, you've got a research question in mind, and you're thinking, well, okay, so how do I look at these photos? You know, what am I going to find out for this? And really what we try to do as a researcher, if it's just us, let's say we're staring at historical photos. That's a good example. Then we're trying to peel back layers of meaning. You know, what's the apparent subject that's being portrayed? What are the dominant themes? And one particular way of doing that is what we call looking through, at, and behind the window. So when we look through the window, we basically just look at what's in there. You know, what's the content? What furniture, what people, what describe it. Then you go back and look again, and you look at the window and you say, well, how is this thing presented? I mean, how is everything arranged? Are there record systems that are all embedded among people, or are they all in the background and people are in the foreground? I mean, what's the arrangement of the elements? And is there sort of any implicit storyline being presented? Like who's sitting and who's standing, who's the boss and who's the subordinate, you know, whatever it may be in relation to what you're trying to find out. And then we can go back again and peel another layer back and look again at the photo and say, well, okay, what about behind it? I mean, you know, is there any suggestion about the context, you know, whether it's formal or informal, particular cultural context, like national culture, ethnic culture, organizational culture? You know, what's the mood? What's the atmosphere? Anything like that at that sort of deeper, more attitudinal, social level. Now, my last line on this slide, as it says, well, now, if you've got any text, written text, well, great. You know, you might then relate what you're seeing or interpreting in the photograph to any surrounding text, because, of course, the photograph might have come out of a book or a manual, and there may be written text associated. Frankly, it's my experience that a lot of the time there isn't any text that's directly talking about the particular photograph you're looking at. But sometimes, you know, that possibility is available to you. Where do you get this stuff? It's pretty, excuse me, it's pretty obvious, but it's well worth rehearsing. I mean, it might be you that, as the researcher, that take the photos of the films, or it might be that you've got people that you're going to interview and they took the photos or the films and they show you. And of course, there might be historical or archival photos and films, your collection, the interviewee's collection, library archives, web sources. So they can come from anywhere. And certainly I have published papers where I and a co-researcher have drawn photographs from my own historical collection. I'm a bit of a strange guy, so I've got a personal collection here in my city office in Adelaide of about 1,500 historical management and accounting texts that go back to 1750 up to about 1950. So I got them from there, but then the web is a fantastic source of archival photographs, and I'm sure most of you know that. Now, you can do this in collaboration. So, for instance, you might be doing contemporary photography. So you've got options. You shoot the photographs, and then you get people who were either in the photos or they know the situation you've been photographing, and you interview them about your photographs. You know, here's my photograph. What do you see in this? What do you think about that? Or it could be that the interviewee goes with you and walks around the area of interest, and they tell you what to photograph. And then you both go and discuss those photographs. Or it could be, and I've done this with a British colleague, where you get the interviewees to take photographs, and then they select a sample and give them to you, and then you interview them about the photographs they took. Or, as you see, the fourth option on the screen is that you shoot, you interview people about photograph based on what they tell you. It's almost like doing probe questioning in interview. Go off and shoot another set of photographs, and then you interview them again. When you do interview people, what I've found, and it's generally recommended, is you've got to be careful not to show them too much. If they become aware that you're going to walk them through 25 photographs, then it's a little bit like the survey questionnaire. They're thinking, oh my God, you know, how long is this interview going to go for? And you start getting quick, short, potentially superficial responses. So it's actually better to show them less, because often what I've found is that the conversation becomes quite extensive. Once they really get into talking about what they think about that photograph, what it reminds them of, you can get a lot out of it. And that leads me to my second point. That is that it's really a superb way of doing an unstructured, or I'd say minimally semi-structured interview, because often when you're talking to interviewees, they'll go off in places you never thought of asking about. So, you know, I can think, well, there's a sign of a door with an interview in progress. And I remember interviewing young accountants about how they saw themselves professionally and where they were going. And some of them photographed a door. And I would say to them, okay, so this is a door. And why have you photographed that? What's that about? They say, oh, that's my boss's door. And I don't want my boss's job. And then they started to tell me why. And then they started to tell me, therefore, how they saw themselves and where they saw themselves going. And it all came triggered from a door. But they went off into areas about their personal professional calling, their attempts to break out of the stereotype of who they're seen as, which I would just never thought of asking about. And of course, after that, the usual post-interview reflection notes is always a good idea. So look, you know, the advantage, I think, in trying out using photo and film in investigating any sort of project, if you've got that sort of resource, is that it's an augmented form of an unstructured or semi-structured interview. It definitely lessens the interviewee's perception of a face-to-face personal interrogation. So, in other words, it becomes like the third person in the room. You're both looking at the photograph and you're both talking together about the photograph. I mean, I think one of the best examples I saw was when I was very early into this methodology. And of course, it's classic, you know, the way how do you get into this stuff? I went and read it up. Then I was running a qualitative methods course for the DBA program at Macquarie University, both in Sydney and Hong Kong. And it was very intensive course, usually about 15 people, totally me, sort of 3 days non-stop and then 2 days non-stop. So you've got to try and keep them alive. And so I thought, oh, well, this is pretty weird, this is pretty different. I'll build in a little session. So I built a little session and then got a big surprise when some of them said, oh, we've used that in consulting assignments on places like BHP Billiton. This is really serious stuff. Well, that's great. So I learned a lot that way. And then I was writing a methodology paper on the historical approach to it, because I thought, well, I'll learn more about it like that. And my wife was doing a small consulting job pro bono for a voluntary organisation, and they were having huge problems with storage and mess, basically. And she'd been off interviewing staff, and they were all busy blaming each other, and nobody taking responsibility for anything. And she said, I just don't know what to do with this. And then she saw this methodology I was playing with, and she said, do you mind if I give that a go? So she went back to the premises and she photographed empty cupboards, tables full of mess, all this stuff. Got herself into a staff meeting that was a regular staff meeting, got allocated half an hour, put the photographs out on the table and said, look, would you all like to sort of comment on this? And she said people gathered together around the table and they started discussing the photographs. And instead of talking about each other, they talked about the common issue. And within half an hour, she started to get results. And I thought that really taught me something about how the photograph becomes the third person. The other point I'd make is down the bottom of this slide is it really is a trigger for recalling vague memories. I mean, if you're interviewing people, now this could be people that are not associated with photograph, but they might know the industry and the era, for example. And you're asking them, well, what do they think about that photograph and what does it remind them of? And have they had any similar experiences? You know, those sort of general probing questions. And often that will trigger them. And you'll get a lot more context and detailed recall than if you just ask them face to face. I mean, if you think about it, I suppose it's a bit like looking at your old holiday photos. I mean, I've got an appalling memory. I mean, my wife's got a fantastic memory for everywhere we've been and what we've done. So she's always saying, don't you remember that back in this year, we were in Prague and we went and saw this, and I'll have a pause and think, God, were we? And then she'll give me a little more detail and suddenly the pictures will come back in my head. If it's a photograph, I will then remember pretty instantly and then I'll start to recall detail. So it's really just that sort of classic everyday sort of experience, I think, that this methodology gives you a bit of an advantage. Now, in terms of interpretation, of course, what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at the image's social context, the context that surrounds, say, the filmmaker or the photographer, the context that surrounds whoever's in the photograph or film. And of course, we've got to remember, if we're interviewing anybody, we've got to think of the context that surrounds them. I mean, there's a classic thing about oral history interviews. What, for example, if you're showing somebody some photographs taken in 1980 and they were teaching then, and they are classroom scenario photographs, and you're asking them certain questions about educational strategies and technology or whatever. Now, the photograph's going to trigger stuff for them, but it's 40 years ago. So we know with oral history that gradually we build up layers of memory in our minds, and the more we've told the story, the more that story gets modified and changed, and it can move a bit away from whatever reality is, but what it may have been. So we do have to remember that when we're looking at historical material, then whatever people recall at interview is going to be a sort of an amalgam of what they've learned in life and work since the period of the photograph, plus what memories they had of the period. So it's a bit of an amalgam. And certainly, I think there's something we often forget, and that is that when we're looking at, for instance, even contemporary photographs, sometimes there's a whole lot of history embedded in that stuff as well. So we sort of need to be aware that you know, the dividing line between what's historical and what's contemporary can be pretty fuzzy. Also, my third point on this slide is that it's, and you'll all know this, but it is okay to use photos and films that were taken with one intention at the time for a completely different research project and objective today. I mean, a classic example would be work I've done with a colleague at University of Edinburgh, Ingrid Jekyll, where we've looked at historical offices. and she got very interested in gender representation and gender involvement in the office and how it happened and when it happened. Now, I'm sure that the photographers of all these office photos that we looked at, which I'll come back to in a moment, were never really thinking about gender. That wasn't probably, it's very unlikely to have been the objective as to why they took the photographs. But it does provide us with some very valuable visual evidence that, in fact, we found provided us some different perspectives than the written texts had been arguing about gender representation in that era, for example. When we examine film, we have to remember that we're looking at a whole lot of things behind a film. Whether it's documentary or whether it's fictional, there's all these predispositions and beliefs and practices and cultural conditioners, which are all very interesting. We may, of course, learn a little more about that from written texts about either the situation in that era or about filmmaking itself. Certainly, film footage, we can treat them either as realist representations. We want to see what they were filming and what people were saying and doing, or we might be looking at their symbolic representations. What sort of attitudes and feelings and emotions were being exhibited or were being, the filmmaker was trying to portray. A point here is that when we're looking at film, and I'm working on that now with some archives at the Scottish Film Archives in Glasgow, you've really got several things you need to be looking at and listening to, and it's obvious when I say it. So there's the imagery, so you're trying to look at the images and see what you can see there, but then there may be a narrator, there may be a narrator voiceover, and that gives you another layer of information and analysis altogether. It might confirm what you're seeing, or it might be telling you something completely different. And then, of course, there may be people engaging in dialogue within the sound of the film itself. So, I'm finding that with a lot of historic films I'm looking at the moment, I sort of have to do it in two layers. I mean, I find it hard to hold all that in my head when I'm watching a film and then going backwards and forwards through it. So often I'll go through and make all my observational notes about the visuals, images first. Then I'll go back and I'll intentionally listen more carefully to, let's say it's the narrator, and overlay the analysis that way. Certainly, yet again, just like the photos, you can learn a lot more about much broader subjects than might be being deliberately portrayed in the film itself. I'll just give you a couple of recent study examples. There's the one about accountant's identity I did with Professor Samantha Warren, who's moved around the British universities a bit. She's now back at Portsmouth. She's probably the leading visual researcher in the management discipline. She's sort of OB HR background. And Ingrid Jekyll at University of Edinburgh, who I mentioned before. Now, if I just quickly tell you about these, the study I did with Sam Warren, we interviewed 32 people, some in London, some in Adelaide. We got them to take 10 photos each. We said, okay, give us 5 photos that you think portray who you are as a professional, and 5 photos that portray who you are not. And you can photograph anything. Doesn't have to be people at work. It could be anything. As I said, few people photographed at door. And what we were trying to see was how accountants conceive of their professional identity and try to manage it, given the way that they're generally stereotyped as, boring old bean counters. And then I had this experience of sitting down and interviewing these people face to face, say here in Adelaide, where I'd bring out the first photograph and I'd say, okay, so is this photograph you or not you? And they would say, yes, that's me. And I'd say, right, well, You know, it's a tree. Great. Why is it you? And off they go in this sort of unstructured way. So I mostly used probe questioning, following up further questions on whatever they said. You know, why is this? Can you give me an example of that? Well, how did that feel? What happened next? You know, all the traditional interview probe questions. And basically what we found, I mean, I'm being very quick and dirty about it, we found that they very deliberately dramatised and mystified their role and image, both inside and outside the workplace. I mean, they even talked about how they dealt with social occasions when somebody said, "What do you do?" And how they described that. And they also were very strong on creating a professional identity that was not their preeminent identity. It was a subset of their overall life values. And in fact, they went into areas about, for instance, social mission callings, religious beliefs. There's a whole lot of stuff they went into which we didn't ask about. And it was lovely because we didn't have to worry about the ethics committee because we didn't ask about it. They volunteered it. And so that I think that's one of the exciting things I found about this sort of method. So to give you an example, there's 3 example photographs that actual interviewees gave us. So, you know, the one on the scooter was saying that, you know, she deliberately went to the office on her scooter so that clients and colleagues could see her as somebody else other than the sort of the black suited corporate person. Yeah, there's one there of somebody working with another colleague. But the front end loader in the forest, I remember that interview where I said, well, great, you know, it's really interesting. Take that. This is me, she said. I remember it was a her. And she said, because I want to show you that I'm just not stuck behind a screen at my desk all the time. I'm out in the field. In fact, I'm out in the field about 70% of my time. And that, in fact, I see my role as an accountant as highly interactive, getting my hands dirty, and on she went in directions that I hadn't anticipated. So, you know, that's just a little example of what it looks like. The study I did with Ingrid Jekyll was a monster of a study. It's got 145 photographs of officers in the 1856 to 1930 period. Originally, I did the study, I did all the photo analysis, and I did the study on 45. And then we got qualitative reviewers who said, oh, that doesn't seem a lot. Couldn't you do more? So given that it was a very highly rated journal and quite difficult to get into, I decided to completely annihilate them. So I did 145. I don't think actually our interpretive story changed. I think we had theoretical saturation of 45. I didn't tell them that. But they felt a lot happier when they saw 145. We used a lot of different sources, you could see, and we were looking at accountability and management control and how scientific management transferred it from the factory into the office. And you can see in the last 3 bullet points there the sort of findings that we came up with. It was a huge study and really quite fascinating. And to give you a visual feel, you know, there's some of the photographs. I mean, the top left one is actually a mail order company. I mean, it really gives a classic feeling of how the individuals are subordinate to the record, and they're the servants of the record. The record totally dominates them. Now, of course, today, in our world today, say if we were an activity-based working office, you wouldn't get that impression because everybody's just walking around with their iPad and their mobile. But the record is nonetheless there, and the record's nonetheless dominating them. The bottom photograph is sort of interesting. I'm sorry, it's a little bit small for you. I actually cut it down. It's actually, there's more people in the photograph than you can see. And the original is very, very sharp and clear. I mean, I've tried counting the rows and how far back to the top right corner those desks go, and it seems like infinity. It's a massive office. They're mostly working on the old comptometer machines, the sort of super static machines. And it's quite interesting in a number of respects. I mean, you will notice that there are guys buried amongst the women there. And I can show you many, many office photographs taken right up into the 1930s, where there's a real gender mix in these offices. We have the traditional stereotype of the female typing pool. Well, yeah, I mean, they're there, but there are a lot of other office functional areas and configurations and populations. But it just gives you a bit of a feel for it. The study I've got in progress at the moment, which I'm sort of in and out of because I've got too many other projects running, is I had a fantastic experience. I work at Glasgow University. Well, if I ever get back there with COVID, but up until now, I've been about 3 times a year working there in blocks of 3 weeks, mostly research consulting to staff and PhD students, and working in the old building at Glasgow University. It's much photographed in the tourist brochures. And I move around various offices, but there's one I tend to inhabit where I look down at the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum, which is also in a lot of tourist photographs. And right next to it is Kelvin Hall, which has had various lives over the last 100 years, everything from sports stadium to motor museum, but it's been through a huge restoration. And it's a bit like History Month, say, in some of our Australian cities. They have an open doors month where you can get into a lot of buildings around Scotland that normally you can't get into or get a view of. And my wife and I took a tour of the restored Kelvin Hall, and much to our surprise, found that the Scottish Film Archives had been moved there into a brand new facility with multiple viewing rooms, lounges. The general public can use it. Fantastic collection. So sometimes I'm one of those people that's totally driven by the data I find. I don't go the traditional track of I've discovered a huge societal problem and now I'm going to investigate it. I mean, I do that sometimes, but not always. So this was a case where I thought, my goodness, this is an incredible resource. I don't know anybody in accounting or management research that's used it. And so I started sort of investigating it. So I'm doing a very broad sort of study which has research questions which I may change depending on the data I'm finding, and I'm looking at office work as filmed from around about 1940 up to about 1970, 1930 to 1970, and I'm interested in the context and the culture that comes through and how that's all represented. The wonderful thing about that moving image archive is you can get it on the web. You can go to it on the web. Now, there's quite a lot of stuff from copyright. You have to be in Glasgow to look at it, but there's a very significant proportion, probably 70%, that you can view directly on your screen in Melbourne or wherever you are. And the archivists have done a fantastic job of cataloguing. So any film is catalogued. They've got about 37 categories of films by subject area. You can look for films by subject area, silent or sound, fiction, non-fiction. There's lots of different ways you can interrogate the site. And then if you spot a particular film where you think, well, that looks a bit interesting, oh, it runs for 15 minutes, then there will be like an abstract. It's a short script that gives you by the minute and second every main thing that's in that movie all the way through. So you can then do a subject search onto that shot record, so that if you're looking for, as I am, office, it will highlight for you every spot there's an office shot and at what point of the film it is and for how many seconds it goes, which is just a superb resource. So I'm working with functional analysis sheets, and I look at a film that I've picked, and I'll look at its functional context, then I'll go back and watch it again for all the staff interactions, then I'll go back and watch it again for roles and attitudes. And as I said before, I'm looking at imagery and I'm looking at dialogue or narration if either of those are present. So it really is sort of like, for me, it's going into another world, and it's just giving a completely different source of evidence and an avenue. And I suspect that sometimes we're just going to end up with it maybe being a solo research method or an adjunct research method where we will rediscover things we thought we already knew. So we may have a certain level of knowledge about a subject based from the traditional research methods we're all familiar with, and this may just cause us to revisit that and either change or nuance our understandings, so we end up understanding things a little differently or a little better than maybe we thought we used to. So I suppose, in summary, in discovering a visual world, as I said at the outset, very limited use of this methodology so far in management accounting research, so it's always nice to be the first person on the block, if only because then if anybody else wants to do it, they've got to cite you. That's being a bit instrumental, sorry. I think it's got huge potential as a standalone and an adjunct methodology. There's a study a colleague of mine, Professor Stephen Walker at Edinburgh University, has done and published in Canada, where he looked at farm management practices in the US, and he used US archives where he had photos and he used photo elicitation, but he had a lot of text that related to those photos. So that was a more integrated approach he was able to use. So for him, I think that photo elicitation was more an adjunct methodology to the textual narrative. Look, it's as I've said, applicable to both historical and contemporary research. I find, anyway, that it gives me a slightly better approach to getting some sort of sense of what it was like to be there, whether that be a contemporary set of photographs or whether it be historical. But overall, it's a visual world. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thanks, Lee. I think that's raised a lot for us to talk about. Phil, you had a question about sound related to things. Do you want to pick that up with Lee?
Yeah, I was just wondering, in the context of produced documentary films, thinking about the soundtrack and the way that the music is used to highlight emotional content potentially, or provide a particular atmosphere to the film, and whether or not that's something that you've looked at and how that changes over time.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it, and I haven't. But even with a documentary, when I reflect on some of the types of background music tracks I've seen, there is real potential there. Probably depending on the type of film you're looking at. I mean, most of the films I'm looking at when I'm looking for historic office footage, they're about organisations and industries and their documentaries. And if they're shot, say, in the 1950s, 1960s, they tend to have that, well, I suppose, their version of music in the background, which, of course, was a sort of a customary style of sort of all's well, upbeat, positive, happy land type music. So I suppose what I'm reflecting there is that the music might be an avenue into the at least intended experiences and emotions within a film. Or they might be reflective of a broader set of contextual attitudes about how you talk about things and how you represent things, even in an industry. So, yeah, you make a great point.
So, Lee, I had a question. Have you ever come across the concept of photo language?
go on a bit more.
Well, I pardon my autocorrects that didn't quite make the message say what I meant. But photo language was an approach. Actually, the materials were established by the Catholic Church Education Office here in Sydney in the 1980s. And they were packs of photos, black and white, that you then use to get learners to elicit ideas and responses to topics. So it's kind of like the reverse of what you're doing. You give them the image and get them to talk about what this strange new image means for them, but it's still using that engagement with the photo, creating the third person, so to speak.
Yeah, look, I wasn't aware of that example, but I would emphasise that if you're using photo elicitation methods, the photos can come from anywhere. So they could be supplied by the people you want to talk to, that they brought them with them and said, I want to talk about this. Or it could be supplied by you or some other organisation. I only asked the question because I thought, oh, you might be talking about photo essay, where, I mean, there are some researchers that actually try to portray an entire interpretive storyline purely through the photographs without the researcher inserting their text, if you like. But yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about fits very, very well inside this sort of genre.
Yeah, it definitely does. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn my...
She's gone offline.
That's okay. I had that experience in the last seminar I did. I forgot to turn my mobile off, and I got 2 major phone calls in the middle of presenting. So.
Yeah. I also thought, Lee, when you're talking about like the management control aspect, some of the work that we're doing now with a student in India, and she's using some of your photo elicitation methods. And interestingly, what she's found is sort of turned on the other side now, and that the managers are using photos to control. So they're actually getting, in this stage, it's clinicians in the field to sort of take photos to sort of demonstrate accountability for their work, and showing that, the number of people and how many are coming, and, that. So I thought that was really quite interesting.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because in my research on offices, and of course now the sort of COVID and post-COVID office scenario, there are discussions now about the greater use of visual surveillance technology for tracking what people are doing. So there's both the potential positive sort of alternative forms of reporting and accountability, like you're describing, with the potential to slip over into the potentially dysfunctional sort of monitoring and control visually. And of course, I mean, those sort of debates and discussions have occurred in terms of like city surveillance monitoring in everyday world as well.
It'd be interesting, even in the films that you're looking at, if you can see that change through the history of surveillance, I suppose. And I thought the other thing would be really interesting is to look at sort of the ethics of choices behind the characters, because that was something that Dale and I were talking about, and Dan as well, and the designs of characters that go into the games. And I thought there'd be the same in the films. And there's sort of ethical choices.
But can you explain a little more? I mean, if like me, you're using archival footage, then I don't have any choice over who's in the footage.
But the developers of the movies, they would have selected people and characters and depicted people in different ways, and I thought that would be quite interesting.
I get it. Yeah, and I agree. Of course, again, one can induce what appear to have been the sort of the choices being made, and sometimes it is quite obvious, although it can still reflect a general sort of societal convention. So, you know, for instance, when I'm looking at meeting rooms and boardroom, or, you know, filmic representations of meeting rooms and boardrooms and stuff like that in the 50s and 60s, you know, it's almost 99% suited males. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that, but that's something I've already noticed, and particular social mores at the time. So you still learn something from it. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Very good point. And it sort of lines up with the whole notion of either a photograph or a film is framed by even the casual holiday photographer. I mean, how many times have we gone nuts because somebody's getting in our way because they're taking way long to frame the single photo shot they want to take, because they're clearly excluding some things and including others, or for background or something. It's the same.
And Lee, may I ask a methodological question regarding the selection of the recording, well, the videos or the photos that you... True that every photo and every video communicate not only a stereotype of the people who are in there, but also a sort of framing for the offices, for the spaces, and how the space is organized. But where is the point in which you are stopping, selecting videos and so on, and you say, okay, this is enough in order to communicate the message and to have a serious and rigorous approach?
Yeah, look, thanks, Lara. It's essentially, I've found, the same principle as you might use in grounded theory and interviewing and open coding. You know, run stuff about what you're trying to find out about. Go away and do a first layer of open coding and memoing on those interview transcripts, and if you get to the end and you're still finding out new stuff, you go out and interview some more people, and the point where you hit saturation is where you realize that, you know, the last 5, 6 or 7 people you interviewed, it's nice, it's, you know, it's detailing things, it's confirming what everybody's been saying before them, but nothing new is turning up. So it's a little bit like that with the photos, which is why I said about that historical study with GCall. I did 45 photos. I mean, I took a huge amount of time analysing stuff, and we wrote the paper. And then when they said, well, you know, we were a bit nervous, you know, only 45, given that we were saying we were using purposive subjects. So we were selecting and finding photographs that appeared to speak to the topic we wanted to investigate. But then, okay, I went and picked a whole lot more. I decided to sort of crash through. So, you know, I picked another 100, and I analysed the whole lot without even, you know, I didn't sort of say to myself, well, things. I broke my methodology and said, right, I'm just going to impress the heck out of them. I'll do another 100. And as I said, in that extra 100, I really didn't find out a whole lot more. Not really. So it showed me that actually stopping it around the 45 was probably a justifiable decision in the first place.
Okay, thank you.
It's Marcus Watson here. Are you aware of the cued recall and video cued recall techniques used in psychology, often in systems design, to look at workplaces to design them?
No, I'm not, Marcus.
So they date back to the 60s, and really powerful methodologies to understand what people do. So if you ask people to tell you about the job, They don't remember everything that's involved. But once you give them some prompts, you can get there. And we can even do this with scenarios where we just give them half a dozen photos at different times and then get them to fill out the story. And I think it overlaps very strongly with what you're doing.
Yeah, look, it certainly sounds like it does. Very, very strongly indeed. Yeah. Oh, thanks for that. I'll go and check it out.
And apologies for having to drop out. That was a very anxious author about to hit a publication deadline. So I just wanted to ask, since you're in accounting and finance and that, have you ever come across the work of Clive Holtham at Cass Business College, London University?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I'll send you a link, because he's also doing some interesting work like you, not just on photo visuals, but he uses a process that's almost managing by wandering around. He actually sends people out into the streets around Cass and they have to come back and describe what they've seen and what the implications and so on things are. Yeah.
That's which is sort of that's good. I'd appreciate the link.
Sure.
It's a little bit like I used to really enjoy this exercise that I used to run with my Doctor of Business Administration students, particularly in Hong Kong, where I'd send them off to do a participant observer exercise. I said, pick anything. I don't care what it is, and they would do a presentation and write just a 2-page summary of what they saw, what they thought was going on, how they felt about the methodology. It was really like a methodological exploration. And I got there was some fantastic stuff. I mean, I remember there was one guy sat on the MTR, the Hong Kong Underground, and he watched how people read newspapers on the way to work, and who read from the sports page at the back and who read from the front. I had someone who went to a cafe and sat in the same corner of the cafe every day for about 2 weeks and watched who came in regularly, what conversations appear to be having. I had another one who had a little boy who used to go and meet his friend on Saturday morning at a basketball court and play with those, what do they call them? Yeah, the robots that Transformers. Used to play with their Transformers. So he asked this young son, could I come and observe you? And he was given strict instructions that he was only allowed to go and sit in the far corner of the basketball court. He was not to interfere with the wonderful time they're having with their Transformers. And some of the observations and reports that came back and the insights from these everyday routine things that people went out and observed certainly were fascinating. And it was one of those situations where the entire class realised the power of that sort of methodology. Yeah, so it sort of reminds me of that a bit.
Yeah, I've put a link in the chat if you want to get in and copy it to Clive and his work. And the process is called dérive, and it comes from some of the French philosophical, psychological work in the 60s and 70s. So it means,
thank you.
It means wandering around. It's a different way of so it sort of takes what you're doing but puts it into motion, I suppose.
Yep.
I use it for my students in Finland. That's part of their management program. They have to complete a dérive looking at how they lead and what they see and so on. So yeah.
Thank you.
Some other questions? We've got a few minutes left. And that author's just had his paper success. It's submitted. That's
well done. That's
so,
great.
Yeah, not yet accepted, but it's through through the front doors. Okay. And any other?
Well, it's a public holiday for you, so you deserve an early minute.
Well, no, most of the others aren't in the state. I think.
Oh, well, Vinod is in New Delhi. Marcus is in Queensland. Dale's in Victoria. Ian, South Wales. I'm in New Zealand.
We're in Sydney,
Yeah.
Will's in Sydney.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where Pradeep is or
Kevin's in New Zealand.
Pradeep's in New Zealand.
No, Kevin.
And Lee, if you should, because we have a sort of a series that we're recording, and Elizabeth had a really interesting session as well earlier, and I wondered about the connections in some ways to Elizabeth's time aspect, because I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit, Elizabeth, about what we had in that workshop that we did with you. But I thought that might be quite interesting in terms of photos as well.
Yeah. Remind me. You tell me what I did.
Well, we had to sort of imagine time stretching out, and through our simulations and through what we do and how time is depicted. And I thought, these different concepts of time was quite fascinating.
Because in a simulation, you can have things like, a 24-hour cycle of business can be represented by an hour in the simulation. And how does that, what does that do to people and their thinking? How do they work? It was, part of the prompt was a lovely quote that I've got that says, time moves. No, we move. Time stays. And it's that issue of how we think about time in ways that, we all have a very settled language around use of time, but when you get to simulation, none of it fits with, once you move into the simulation, none of the standard concepts about time stay the same. That's it briefly. I can send you the session for sure.
Interesting.
Another thing along the same lines as that is where people come in time. So if you were to take the same photos, Lee, and show that to different generations, I'd be fascinated about what they see and how their cognitive biases come in to it, about their expectations compared to what's actually in the images. And the office would be a really powerful one. So I'm sure that there would be an undercounting of males by the younger generation. They just wouldn't perceive them there because they're trying to reinforce the stereotype that they've been taught. And it's just that males working in offices are not seen as powerful people, so we forget about them. But it'd be interesting across generations, because I'm sure if you show that to my mother-in-law, who worked in similar situations, she'd be able to tell you a whole lot of details about the social interactions.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very good point. I mean, and of course, it would depend on the research question you were pursuing. But I hadn't thought about that either, and you can certainly see that actually that would give you some sets of information that would be relevant to almost any research question, really. Yeah.
And that's Marcus's comment has just reminded me of the marvelous figure called Hidden Figures, the marvelous movie. Have you seen Hidden Figures, Lee?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you must have a look at it. It's a fabulous play on all sorts of things. The name itself, it's the biographical reporting of the women who were the calculators,
computers,
all the numbers for the initial NASA flights.
Oh, I did see it. I did. Yes.
Yeah. And NASA's just renamed their headquarters for the lead figure in that.
Oh,
that's right. Yes. I heard they had, Philip. Yeah.
So which one did they?
Was it Mary Jackson? Is that the right name?
Oh, okay.
Mary, Mary Johnson or something like that. I should know. I'm a bit embarrassed. But
it is a brilliant movie, but it is interesting to see that the movie isn't representative of the actual layouts. So the director was in the room with them. It's very structurally different to the way things are. And the white and black officers were exactly the same. They're a mirror image of each other, but in the movie they're portrayed as different. But I think a brilliant movie, absolutely brilliant. And what an impact she had, especially the truth bits where computers, they're unsure about the computer's outcome and she can calculate it, and the astronauts aren't prepared to go unless she's calculated it. I think those are really, really fantastic bits.
And Vinod's put in a message in there, Lee, that he's enjoyed the images and particularly learning about hermeneutics for the first time. So a whole new world for him.